My name is Willow Hall. I'm in my late 30s. I live a life most people would describe as steady, sensible, and even enviable from the outside. I've been a wife, a planner, the calm center in rooms where emotions ran high. I've built a reputation for being reliable, the woman who remembers birthdays, organizes gatherings, smooths tensions before they turn awkward. The kind of person people assume will always be there, quietly holding things together. People often underestimate me because I don't raise my voice. I don't rush to correct misunderstandings. I don't fight for attention. I listen more than I speak, and when I do speak, it's measured. To some, that reads as softness, to others as passivity. What they don't usually consider is that silence can be a form of observation, and patience can be a way of seeing everything clearly. This story isn't about rage. It isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliating anyone or winning in the way social media loves to frame things. It's about awareness. It's about what happens when you finally accept the truth of a relationship exactly as it is, not as you've been taught to protect or explain it away. It's the story of how I smiled at our 10th wedding anniversary, with a signed divorce petition hidden in my bag. How I raised a glass, posed for photos, and played the perfect wife, knowing the marriage was already over long before the celebration ended. I'm telling this not to shock you and not to invite judgment. There are no dramatic twists, no secret affairs revealed in a single explosive moment. Instead, this is a slow, honest walk through small dismissals, quiet realizations, and the steady accumulation of clarity. It's about how disrespect doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles in gently, so gently you mistake it for normal life. You won't hear me paint myself as a victim. I stayed longer than I should have, and I understand why I did. You also won't hear me turn my former partner into a villain. People don't have to be monsters to cause harm. Sometimes they just grow comfortable with taking more than they notice. What I promise you is honesty. I'll tell you who I was to them. I'll tell you when I doubted myself. I'll tell you how silence shifted from something imposed on me into something I chose. And I'll tell you why the end, when it finally came, didn't feel like an explosion, but like exhaling after holding my breath for years. If you're listening to this because you've ever felt unseen in a relationship, or because you've wondered whether quiet endurance is the same thing as love, I want you to know this story isn't meant to push you toward leaving or staying. It's meant to help you see more clearly yourself, your patterns, your power. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without pressure. Have you ever realized something was already over, long before anyone else noticed? For a long time, I was described using the same small collection of words: easygoing, low maintenance, understanding. People said these things with affection, or at least what sounded like affection. I learned later that those words were doing more work than I realized. They were shorthand. They meant I didn't demand much. I didn't interrupt the flow. I didn't complicate anyone else's comfort. To my husband, I was the steady one, the person he never worried about. If something slipped his mind, I remembered it. If he was stressed, I adjusted. If plans changed at the last minute, I adapted without complaint. He'd say, "You're so calm about everything," like it was a compliment. and I accepted it that way, even when calm required swallowing disappointment. To his family, I was dependable background music, present at every holiday, helpful in the kitchen, polite in conversations that never quite included me fully. They trusted me with logistics, with errands, with making things run smoothly, rarely with decisions, rarely with opinions that mattered. To friends, I was the listener, the one who could be counted on to show up, nod thoughtfully, and offer balanced perspectives. I wasn't the dramatic one. I wasn't the loud one. I was the one people felt safe talking to because I didn't redirect the spotlight toward myself. And to be clear, I helped build that image. I thought that was what love looked like. I thought contribution without friction was maturity. I believed that if I made myself easy to be with, I would be valued for the peace I brought. What I didn't understand yet was how invisibility can masquerade as harmony. In our marriage, I was rarely asked what I wanted. Not because my husband was cruel, but because he had learned accurately that I wouldn't insist. If he chose the restaurant, I could find something on the menu. If he planned the weekend around his work schedule, I could rearrange mine. If decisions were made without me in the room, I could be brought up to speed later. I told myself this was a compromise. Those relationships weren't about keeping score, that love meant flexibility. But over time, something subtle happened. My preferences stopped being forgotten and started being assumed irrelevant, not debated, not rejected, just quietly bypassed. At dinner parties, he'd interrupt me mid sentence, not aggressively, just seamlessly, as if my voice were a draft version of his thought. He'd finish the story. Everyone would laugh. I'd smile and let it pass. When we talked about the future, my ideas were met with a gentle, "We'll see," which somehow always turned into his plan months later. When I pointed it out, he'd look genuinely confused. "I didn't know you felt that strongly about it," he'd say. And I'd soften, because maybe I hadn't made it clear enough. That became the pattern. If I felt overlooked, it must be because I hadn't communicated well. If I felt small, it was because I hadn't spoken loudly enough. The responsibility always circled back to me, quietly, politely. What no one saw was how carefully I was watching. I noticed who my husband consulted when decisions mattered. I noticed whose discomfort registered immediately and whose could wait. I noticed that when I did express a boundary, it was treated like an inconvenience instead of information. Still, I didn't dramatize it, not even in my own mind. I didn't cry in bathrooms or write angry messages I never sent. I told myself I was lucky. We didn't fight, we didn't scream, we didn't betray each other in obvious ways. From the outside, we were solid, admirable even. 10 years married, no scandals. A shared life that looked orderly and grown up. Inside, I was slowly learning the role I played. The woman you don't have to check in with. The one who will adapt. The one who will absorb disappointment quietly so the room stays comfortable. I wasn't miserable. That's important to say. I functioned well. I laughed. I worked. I showed up. But there was a dull sense of being edited out of my own life. Not erased, just reduced to supporting text. At the time, I didn't call it invisibility. I called it maturity. Only later did I understand that being valued only for how little space you take is not the same thing as being loved. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important when it happened. That's why it mattered. It was a dinner with friends. One of those comfortable, slightly noisy evenings where conversation overlaps and no one is really listening all the time. We were talking about a possible move. Nothing urgent, just hypothetical. Someone asked how we felt about leaving the city. I answered honestly. I said I loved where we lived, that my work was rooted there, that I felt settled in a way I hadn't before. I remember choosing my words carefully, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to sound reasonable. Before I finished, my husband laughed lightly and said, "She's flexible. She'll be fine anywhere." It wasn't said with malice. It wasn't said to embarrass me. It was said casually, like a fact everyone already knew. The conversation moved on. No one noticed that I'd stopped speaking. No one asked what I thought beyond that. They took his statement as clarification, as if he'd simply translated my feelings into something more efficient. I smiled. I even nodded. Later that night, when we were alone, I brought it up gently. I told him it had bothered me, that I'd felt brushed aside. He looked surprised, not defensive, just puzzled. "I didn't mean anything by it," he said. "Everyone knows you're adaptable." That word again, adaptable. He kissed my forehead, the way you do when you think you've soothed something minor. "You're reading too much into it." I let it go. That was the first small cut. Not because of what he said, but because of what happened next. I felt something register inside me, and then I dismissed it myself. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself it wasn't worth making a big deal out of. And because I didn't make a big deal out of it, no one else did either. What I didn't realize then was that this was the moment my internal record keeping began. Not in a bitter way, in a quiet, almost clinical way. A mental note filed under information. I started noticing how often my flexibility was spoken for me instead of by me. At a family gathering, his mother mentioned an upcoming holiday and assumed we'd host. "Willow doesn't mind," she said, smiling warmly. I hadn't been asked. I hadn't agreed. But the assumption stood unchallenged. And again, I nodded. At work, I watched how differently I was treated when I set boundaries versus when I absorbed extra tasks without comment. Praise came more easily when I said yes. Discomfort appeared the moment I hesitated. None of these moments was dramatic. That's what made them powerful. They were small enough to ignore, easy enough to rationalize. I told myself this was what being easy to love looked like. But each time, something tiny was taken without acknowledgement. A preference, a voice, a right to define myself. I didn't confront it because I couldn't yet name it. I just felt it, and I carried on, smiling, adapting, being the person everyone relied on to not need anything. What stayed with me most about that first dinner wasn't the comment itself. It was how natural it felt to everyone else. How unquestioned it was that someone else could speak for me, and that I would quietly accept the translation. That's when I learned something important about disrespect. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it slips in, disguised as familiarity, as confidence, as knowing you so well they forget to ask. And when it's small enough, everyone expects you to overlook it, including yourself. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling like an exception. It becomes context. After that first small cut, moments like it didn't disappear. They blended into the background of daily life. Comments made on my behalf, Decisions were finalized before I was consulted. Jokes that landed just lightly enough to be defended as harmless if I ever questioned them. And most of the time, I didn't. Not because I didn't notice, but because I had learned how to translate discomfort into something more socially acceptable. He didn't mean it. They're just used to me being easy. It's not worth the tension. That last one became my favorite explanation. Tension was something I believed good partners avoided. So when I felt it rising, I smoothed it out, often by folding myself smaller. If my husband forgot something important to me, I reminded him cheerfully. If my opinion was bypassed, I offered it later, carefully framed so it wouldn't sound like disagreement. If plans conflicted with my needs, I adjusted my needs. What I told myself was that I was choosing peace. What I didn't admit was that peace, in this form, required my silence. There were patterns I could have named if I'd wanted to. How his stress always took priority over my exhaustion. How my disappointments were treated as emotional, while his were treated as logistical problems to solve immediately. How often I said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. But I wasn't angry enough to justify making a scene. Because that was the unspoken rule. Unless something is explosive, it doesn't count. And I was never explosive. I watched how quickly people responded to raised voices, to visible frustration, to ultimatums. I also watched how invisible calm discomfort could be. How easy it was to step over it without noticing. So I became skilled at not making my discomfort visible. I laughed things off. I reframed moments into jokes about myself. I told friends, "It's not a big deal," until I started believing it. Or at least stopped checking whether it was true. The danger wasn't that anyone was cruel. The danger was that everyone, including me, was comfortable. Comfortable with me being the one who adjusted. Comfortable with me being the one who understood. Comfortable with the idea that if something really mattered to me, I'd surely say so more forcefully. But what if forcefulness had never been safe for me? What if I'd learned early that being agreeable earned approval and being difficult earned distance? I didn't connect those dots at the time. I just knew that pushing back felt like risking the relationship itself. And so, I normalized what was happening. I made it part of the landscape. This is what marriages look like, I thought. Two people with different needs, and one of them is better at bending. I didn't feel abused. I didn't feel trapped. I felt edited. Like certain parts of me were unnecessary to the story we were telling together. Every time I rationalized a dismissal, it became easier for the next one to pass unnoticed. The bar for what counted as worth addressing kept moving higher. And slowly, without anyone ever saying it out loud, I learned the expectation placed on me. Be understanding first. Be patient. Be quiet. Be grateful that nothing was worse. By the time I realized how much I'd normalized, the behavior didn't even register as disrespect anymore. It registered as a marriage. Roles aren't always announced. Sometimes they're handed to you gently, piece by piece, until one day you realize you've been performing in a script you never agreed to. Mine was the role of the reliable one, the woman who could be counted on to manage the details, absorb the inconvenience, and make everything look effortless from the outside. The role didn't come with authority. It came with responsibility. In our marriage, this meant I handled the invisible labor, remembering appointments, tracking family obligations, knowing which friends needed follow ups and which conversations required smoothing over later. If something fell apart, it was assumed I'd fix it, or at least cushion the impact. When things went well, it was just how life was. When things went wrong, there was a quiet expectation that I'd adjust faster. My husband trusted me completely. That was how he described it. "I don't worry about you," he'd say. "You always handle things." At the time, I felt proud of that. Trust felt like intimacy. Being needed felt like purpose. But trust, I learned, can turn into neglect when it's no longer paired with attention. I wasn't asked how I was coping. It was assumed I was fine. I wasn't consulted about decisions that affected me. It was assumed I'd adapt. I wasn't checked in with emotionally. It was assumed I was stable. Stability became my defining trait. At gatherings, if someone needed help, eyes turned to me. If there was a gap in planning, I filled it. If tension arose, I smoothed it over. People thanked me, but no one ever asked if I wanted to be doing it. And I rarely asked myself either, because asking would have disrupted the role. It would have introduced friction. It would have required me to explain why being reliable didn't mean being limitless. The truth is, the role worked for everyone else. It allowed my husband to focus on his ambitions without worrying about the emotional infrastructure of his life. It allowed our families to enjoy gatherings without logistical stress. It allowed our friends to rely on a steady presence. What it didn't allow was reciprocity. When I needed something, space, reassurance, consideration, I struggled to articulate it without feeling like I was breaking character. Needs sounded like complaints. Boundaries sounded like ingratitude. So I stayed within the lines. I told myself that every relationship has roles, that mine just happened to be this one. I told myself that my strength was in my steadiness. But there was a cost. The cost was that my inner life slowly became something I experienced alone. My disappointments were processed privately. My questions were held internally. My doubts were tucked away so they wouldn't interfere with the smooth operation of our shared life. I wasn't invisible because no one could see me. I was invisible because the version of me they relied on didn't include my full humanity. And I helped maintain that version. I didn't know yet that roles can be rewritten. I only knew that stepping outside of mine felt dangerous. Not because anyone threatened me, but because I'd built so much of my value around staying inside it. Looking back, this was the stage where my silence stopped being accidental. It became structural. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic realization that cracked the room open. It happened on a quiet afternoon. I almost forgot. I was sitting alone at our kitchen table. The house empty in that rare, peaceful way it sometimes was. A mug of coffee had gone cold in front of me. My laptop was open, untouched. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just staring, letting my mind wander in the spaces it usually didn't have time for. And then I noticed something small and unsettling. I felt relieved that no one needed me. The feeling surprised me. It wasn't exhaustion exactly. It wasn't anger. It was a gentle, almost guilty sense of ease that came from being temporarily unassigned. No tasks to manage, no moods to anticipate, no adjustments to make. Just me, sitting, unobserved. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly, but internally. I realized how rare that feeling had become. How much of my daily life was structured around responding, accommodating, and staying available. I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. Who am I when I'm not being useful? The answer didn't come immediately. What came instead was another question, quieter but heavier. When was the last time anyone checked on me the way I check on them? I tried to remember. I genuinely did. Not a polite, "How are you?" in passing, but a real pause. A moment where my state mattered enough to slow things down. I couldn't find one. That realization didn't hurt in the way heartbreak does. It felt more like clarity, cool, sobering, undeniable. Like finally seeing the shape of something you'd been walking around in the dark. I understood then that I had been living inside an assumption. That being easy to live with was the same as being cherished. It wasn't. I didn't confront my husband that day. I didn't journal. I didn't cry. I finished my coffee, closed my laptop, and went on with my evening as planned. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time, I stopped asking how to explain my feelings better and started asking whether they were being considered at all. I noticed how often my husband spoke about our life as something he managed, rather than something we shaped together. How rarely he asked what I wanted, unless it directly affected his plans. How comfortable he was with my silence. And I noticed my own complicity, not with blame, but with honesty. I had trained people to expect me to be okay with less. I had rewarded inattention with accommodation. I had mistaken endurance for love. That afternoon didn't make me angry. It made me awake. I realized I didn't need a dramatic reason to question my place in my own life. I didn't need proof of betrayal or cruelty. I only needed to acknowledge the truth of my experience. And the truth was this: I felt lonelier inside my marriage than I ever had on my own. That understanding settled quietly, like a decision that hadn't yet been named, but could no longer be undone. After that afternoon, my silence changed. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still showed up. I still smiled. I still handled the details. But internally, I was no longer trying to be understood. I stopped explaining myself, not in a cold way, not in a punitive way. I simply noticed how much energy I had spent translating my needs into something palatable, and how little of that translation had ever been required of anyone else. So I paused. When my husband talked over me, I didn't jump back in to finish the thought. I let the conversation move on without me. When plans were made without my input, I didn't rush to adjust my schedule automatically. I observed what happened when I didn't fill the gap. Most of the time, nothing happened. That was the point. My silence, which had once been automatic, became deliberate. And because it looked exactly the same from the outside, no one noticed the shift. People often mistake quiet for absence. But silence can be a form of presence when it's chosen. I was still listening, still watching, still taking note of patterns I had once rushed to excuse. The difference was that I no longer rushed to repair the discomfort they created. At first, I wondered if this was passive aggressive. I checked myself carefully. But the truth was, I wasn't withholding to punish anyone. I was conserving energy. I was creating space to see clearly. And in that space, something became obvious. My husband didn't miss my voice. He didn't ask why I spoke less in group settings. He didn't check in when I stopped volunteering opinions. He didn't notice that I had become more neutral, more contained. Instead, he seemed more relaxed. Without my gentle interruptions, my clarifications, my emotional buffering, life flowed smoothly for him. Decisions were faster. Conversations were simpler. There was less friction. That told me everything I needed to know. I realized then that my presence had been valuable primarily for how it reduced effort for others, not for who I was, but for what I prevented: conflict, complexity, emotional labor. My silence wasn't read as pain, it was read as efficiency. And once I saw that, I stopped feeling guilty. I didn't announce a change, I didn't demand recognition. I simply allowed people to experience what my absence from certain roles felt like, without filling in the blanks for them. This wasn't withdrawal, it was an assessment. I was learning what remained when I stopped overfunctioning, what balance actually looked like when I wasn't quietly tipping the scales. And what remained, I saw clearly, was a relationship that continued just fine without my inner world. That's when I understood something unsettling but liberating. If your silence goes unnoticed, your presence was never fully engaged with in the first place. While everything on the surface stayed the same, something else began, quietly, methodically, and completely unnoticed. I started paying attention in a different way, not to emotions, but to facts. I noticed how often my name appeared on documents versus how often my input had actually been requested. I noticed which accounts I had access to, which ones I didn't, and which ones I managed by default without being formally acknowledged. I noticed patterns in spending, in decision making, and in whose priorities were treated as time sensitive. This wasn't paranoia, it was inventory. For years, I had been emotionally attentive. Now, I have become structurally attentive. I began keeping records, not secret ones, not dramatic ones, just copies, statements, emails, calendars, notes from conversations that had once slipped past me because I assumed good intent was enough. I wasn't looking for wrongdoing, I was looking for clarity. At the same time, I started learning, quietly, in the margins of my life. I read about financial independence within marriage, about how shared assets are actually treated when shared is never clearly defined, about how emotional labor often hides legal and economic imbalance. I didn't tell anyone I was doing this, not because it was forbidden, but because it would have invited questions I wasn't ready to answer. Questions that would have required me to justify my curiosity, as if wanting to understand my own life required permission. What no one noticed was how calm I became. The more information I gathered, the less reactive I felt. Uncertainty had always been the thing that kept me accommodating. Once uncertainty began to dissolve, so did the urgency to explain myself. I saw clearly how much of our stability relied on my quiet management, and how little of that was documented or protected. I also saw something else, equally important. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I had assumed that if I ever really looked at the imbalance, rage would follow. Instead, what I felt was distance, emotional distance, not coldness, but objectivity. I stopped framing the marriage as a story about love and started seeing it as a system where roles had calcified, where one person benefited from things staying exactly as they were, and where the other was expected to keep compensating silently. And systems don't change because of feelings. They change because of leverage. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I was learning. I only knew that I was done being uninformed, done trusting that goodwill alone would protect me, done assuming that being nice was the same thing as being safe. All of this happened without visible disruption. I still smiled. I still attended events. I still played my part well. That's the part no one ever notices. When someone stops being naive, they don't announce it. They just become harder to misread. And by the time anyone senses the shift, the groundwork is already laid. The reveal didn't arrive as a rupture, it arrived as alignment. By the time I reached it, nothing felt sudden. There was no swap here, no cinematic moment where everything snapped into focus at once. What happened instead was quieter and far more permanent. Every vague discomfort I'd carried for years finally found its proper name and place. What I discovered wasn't a secret in the way people imagine secrets. There was no affair, no single act of cruelty I could point to and say, this is where everything broke. If there had been, it might have been easier. Clear villains make clean exits. What I uncovered was a pattern so consistent it had become invisible. I started seeing how our life was organized, not emotionally, but structurally. How time was allocated, how risk was distributed, how flexibility always seemed to flow in one direction, how growth, when it required sacrifice, was framed as mutual. But the cost quietly landed on me. I looked at decisions we'd made over the years, moves, job shifts, financial priorities, and noticed something I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. My compromises were assumed, his were negotiated. My adaptability was treated as a given, his as a favor. And because nothing about this was dramatic, I had never felt justified in questioning it. The clarity came gradually, through accumulation. An account I managed but wasn't formally recognized on. A decision logged as joint that I had been informed about after the fact. A recurring pattern where my labor, emotional and logistical, made outcomes possible, while credit flowed elsewhere. None of it was illegal. None of it was malicious. All of it was unequal. I remember one evening in particular. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists late at night when the world feels briefly paused. I spread documents across the dining table, not in distress, not in urgency, just methodically, like someone finally laying out pieces they'd been carrying in their pockets for years. As I read, I felt something unexpected. Calm, not relief, not anger, calm. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to interpret feelings. I was looking at facts. And facts don't gaslight you. They don't minimize themselves. They simply exist. What became clear was this. The marriage was stable because I was stabilizing it. Emotionally, practically, quietly. My consistency absorbed the imbalance so efficiently that it never registered as an imbalance at all. I thought about how often I'd been told, we make a great team, and how little that team metaphor reflected reality. Teams rotate roles. Teams share the load. Teams notice when one member is carrying more weight. This wasn't a team. It was a system that functioned smoothly because one person compensated silently. And then another realization surfaced. Slower, heavier. If something happened to me, if I stepped back, burned out, or simply stopped compensating, the system wouldn't collapse dramatically. It would stall, confuse people, create inconvenience, and then someone else would step in to manage what I used to handle, and life would continue. I wouldn't be missed as me. I would be missed as a function. That thought didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified. I finally understood why asking for more had always felt uncomfortable. It wasn't because my needs were unreasonable. It was because the structure of the relationship depended on my not having any that required adjustment. Love had been used unconsciously, gently, as a justification for imbalance. And I had participated in that justification because I believed that being chosen meant being secure. It doesn't. Love without structure is sentiment. Love without reciprocity is labor. What struck me most that night wasn't resentment toward my husband. It was the absence of surprise. Somewhere inside me, I had known this all along. I had just chosen not to translate it into a language that required action. The private reveal wasn't about uncovering betrayal. It was about acknowledging reality without cushioning it. I saw how thoroughly I had relied on goodwill as protection. How often I told myself he wouldn't let anything happen to me without ever asking, what systems are actually in place if things change? That's when I understood something that shifted everything. I didn't need proof of bad intentions to justify choosing myself. I didn't need him to become a villain. I didn't need a dramatic ending. I didn't even need to be angry. I only needed to accept that the version of marriage I was in required my quiet sacrifice to continue, and that I was no longer willing to offer it. The realization was steady, grounded, almost clinical. This marriage worked. It just didn't work for me. Once I allowed myself to say that without apology, the internal debate ended. Not because a decision had been made yet, but because denial was no longer available as an option. I folded the documents carefully, not in haste, not in fear, with intention. I went to bed that night beside my husband, aware of the physical closeness and the structural distance between us. I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel guilty. I slept deeply because confusion, the thing that had kept me compliant for so long, was finally gone. Clarity doesn't shout, it settles. And once it does, nothing returns to the way it was. Clarity doesn't rush you, it slows you down. That was the first thing I noticed after the fog lifted. There was no urgency anymore, no emotional pressure to do something just to relieve discomfort. For years, discomfort had been the engine of my compliance. I adjusted because unease demanded immediate resolution. I smoothed things over because tension felt dangerous. But now, with clarity, tension lost its power. I lived inside the knowing for a while. I went to work. I answered messages. I cooked dinners. I laughed at the right moments. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had reorganized itself. I wasn't rehearsing arguments anymore. I wasn't cataloging slides. I wasn't wondering whether I was imagining things. The questions that had once looped endlessly in my mind were gone. In their place was something steadier: evaluation. I began to see my situation the way I might see a map, without panic, without judgment, just options, paths, consequences. And there were three of them. The first option was to stay exactly as I was, but with my eyes open. This path didn't require courage. It required acceptance. Acceptance that the marriage functioned because I carried the invisible weight. Acceptance that my adaptability would continue to be interpreted as consent. Acceptance that being valued for my steadiness meant rarely being asked what I wanted. I imagined this version of my future carefully, not dramatically, honestly. I saw myself continuing to manage logistics, emotions, and relationships. I saw the same dinners, the same routines, the same assumptions. I saw myself growing quieter, Not because I had less to say, but because I had learned that saying it didn't alter the structure. This path offered stability, familiarity, predictability. What it didn't offer was growth. And I knew something about myself by then. I could endure many things, but I could not unknow what I knew. Staying would require me to actively suppress my awareness, to pretend that clarity hadn't arrived, to live divided. That kind of endurance doesn't make you strong, it makes you smaller. The second option was reform. This was the option people imagine first when they hear stories like mine. The heartfelt conversation, the carefully chosen words, the mutual recognition of imbalance, the promise to do better. I didn't dismiss this option lightly. I imagined sitting across from my husband at the table, explaining what I had seen, not accusingly, not emotionally, but clearly. I imagined his initial confusion, his insistence that he hadn't meant any harm, his genuine surprise that I felt this way. I imagined the apologies, the intention to change, the reassurances. And then I imagined what came after. Because change isn't sustained by intention alone, it's sustained by structure. And I knew, without malice, without resentment, that if this path were chosen, the responsibility for maintaining balance would still fall to me. I would have to notice when old patterns resurfaced. I would have to remind. I would have to correct. I would have to enforce boundaries that had never existed before. In other words, I would still be managing the system, just more visibly. And I asked myself a question I couldn't avoid. Do I want a marriage where equity depends on my constant vigilance? The answer came quietly but firmly. No, not because he couldn't change, but because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life supervising my own inclusion. The third option was the one I had avoided naming for a long time. Not because it was frightening, but because it was final. This option required accepting something deeply uncomfortable. That some relationships don't end because people refuse to love each other, but because the conditions under which they function require one person to diminish themselves. It required acknowledging that my husband didn't need to become cruel for the marriage to be wrong for me. Waiting for wrongdoing was just another way of postponing self-respect. This option wasn't fueled by anger. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't revenge. It was alignment. Alignment between what I now understand and how I was willing to live. I noticed something important as I considered it. My body felt calm when I imagined leaving. Not excited, not terrified. Calm, like a muscle unclenching after years of tension. That's how I knew the decision wasn't impulsive. Impulses are loud. This was quiet. I thought about time, how much of it I had already given. I thought about future versions of myself. I thought about the woman I would be in 10 more years if nothing changed. And then I asked myself the most honest question of all. If this were my daughter, my closest friend, would I tell her to stay? The answer was immediate, no explanation required. The decision point, I realized, wasn't about choosing between love and freedom. It was about choosing between familiarity and integrity. Once that became clear, everything else followed naturally. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel brave. I didn't even feel sad in the way people expect. I felt resolved. This wasn't a rejection of my husband. It was a refusal to continue a version of myself that required constant self-erasure. I didn't announce the decision because decisions don't need witnesses to be real. I didn't threaten departure to see if things would change. I didn't test outcomes. I simply stopped negotiating with myself. The future I chose didn't appear all at once. It didn't come with certainty about logistics or timelines. But the direction was set. And once direction is set, the details become procedural. That was the moment the marriage truly ended. Not on paper, not in public, not at the anniversary table. It ended when I accepted that fairness was not something I should have to earn in silence. From that point forward, every step I took was no longer about whether, only about how. Once the decision was made, noise became unnecessary. There was no emotional build-up demanding release, no urge to hint or provoke a reaction. I didn't need validation anymore. I didn't need him to understand. Understanding, I had learned, often comes too late to matter. What I needed was precision. I began moving the way I had always moved, quietly, but now with intention, not hiding, not sneaking, just acting without commentary. I consulted professionals without announcing it. A lawyer first, not in a dramatic, I'm leaving way, but in a measured, informational one. I asked questions. I listened carefully. I took notes. I learned what was mine, what was shared, and what timelines actually looked like when emotions were removed from the equation. There was comfort in that neutrality, in knowing that systems exist for moments like this, and that I didn't have to reinvent the process just to prove something. I organized my finances, not because anything was wrong, but because clarity requires structure. I opened accounts in my own name. I made copies of documents. I ensured access to what I had quietly maintained for years. None of this disrupted daily life. We still ate dinner together, still discussing weekend plans, still attended events as a couple. If anything, I seemed calmer, less reactive, more contained. My husband didn't notice. Why would he? The marriage still functioned. I still handled what I had always handled. The absence hadn't begun yet, not in ways that affected him. That's the strange thing about preparation. It looks like normalcy from the outside. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically. I didn't punish him with coldness. That would have raised questions. That would have turned this into a conflict. And I wasn't interested in conflict. I was interested in exiting without damage. Every step I took was reversible, except the direction. And that was intentional. I wasn't rushing toward a door. I was clearing a path so that when I walked through it, I wouldn't stumble. There were moments, quiet ones, when I felt the weight of what I was doing, not guilt, responsibility. Ending a marriage isn't trivial, even when it's necessary. I allowed myself to feel that without letting it derail me. Emotion didn't drive the process. Alignment did. I didn't announce my readiness because readiness doesn't need an audience. It only needs honesty. And by the time the visible consequences arrived, everything that mattered had already been handled. Carefully, calmly, and without spectacle. The consequences didn't arrive with a crash. They arrived as an absence. At first, it was subtle enough to be dismissed. Small delays, minor oversights, things that had always been handled quietly, efficiently, no longer resolved themselves. A bill went unpaid longer than usual. A family obligation was nearly forgotten. A social plan fell apart because no one had followed up. None of these were catastrophic. That's why they mattered. My husband mentioned them casually at first. I thought you were taking care of that, he said once, not accusingly, just surprised. I apologized automatically, then stopped myself halfway through the sentence. Instead, I said, I didn't. The word hung there, unfamiliar. He nodded, distracted, moved on. But the pattern continued. He began asking more questions. Not about me, but about processes, where things were kept, how certain arrangements worked, when reminders were usually sent. It never occurred to him that I had been choosing to manage these things. He experienced them as features of our life, not as labor. So when those features flickered, confusion followed. There was no confrontation yet, just friction, the kind that makes people restless without knowing why. I watched this carefully, not with satisfaction, but with interest. This wasn't punishment, it was data. I noticed how quickly inconvenience registered when it affected him, how rapidly solutions were sought when something disrupted his flow, how naturally the expectation arose that I would step back in to stabilize things, and how strange it felt not to comply. I didn't announce a withdrawal, I simply didn't compensate. When he was stressed, I didn't preemptively soften the environment. When something slipped, I let it be noticed. When he asked where something was, I answered factually, without cushioning. The marriage began to feel different. Not because I was doing something new, but because I had stopped doing something old. And for the first time, the imbalance was no longer absorbed quietly. Still, he didn't connect it to me, not emotionally, not structurally. He experienced the consequences as a series of unrelated inconveniences, not as a shift in the foundation. That's what happens when someone has never had to see the scaffolding. By the time he sensed that something was off, the change was already underway, and it didn't ask for his permission. The moment he realized something was wrong didn't come with certainty. It came with unease, a subtle, creeping sense that the systems he relied on were no longer self-correcting, that the ease he had grown accustomed to now required effort. Questions he'd never needed to ask began surfacing, not all at once, but persistently. Are you okay? He asked one evening finally. Not urgently, not deeply, just enough to acknowledge a disturbance. I'm fine, I said, and I meant it. What he was sensing wasn't my distress, it was my detachment. He started paying attention in ways he hadn't before, noticing my quiet, watching my routines, asking small, tentative questions about plans, about timing, about where things stood between us. But the questions came too late and from the wrong place. They weren't about understanding, they were about restoration. I could see it clearly. He wanted the marriage to feel the way it used to feel, for him. He wanted the smoothness back, the predictability, the comfort of knowing that whatever he overlooked would be handled somewhere else. That's when the panic began. Not dramatic, not explosive. It showed up as urgency disguised as care, sudden offers to help more, vague promises to do better, a heightened attentiveness that felt unfamiliar and slightly out of sync, like someone learning a language only after realizing they might lose access to the conversation. I listened, calmly, kindly, and I felt nothing shift inside me, because repair requires timing as much as intention. And by the time he reached for change, I had already moved past the place where change would have mattered. He wanted reassurance. I offered honesty. I don't think this is something we can fix the way you think, I said one night carefully. He looked startled, not angry, confused, as if the ground had shifted beneath him without warning. But I'm trying, he said, and I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Not that he didn't care, But that care had arrived only when the cost became visible to him, only when the system stopped running smoothly. What he didn't understand was that my leaving wasn't a reaction to the present moment. It was the result of years of unaddressed imbalance, years of silence mistaken for consent. You can't rush to the exit and expect someone to reopen the door just because you've decided to pay attention. By the time he asked what I needed, I no longer needed anything from him. And that's when he realized, too late, that the marriage hadn't begun ending when I grew quiet. It had begun ending when my quiet went unnoticed. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a formality. There was no shouting. No accusations were laid out like evidence in a courtroom. No list of grievances sharpened by years of resentment. By the time we sat down to talk, really talk, I had already said everything that mattered to myself. We were sitting across from each other at the same table, where I had once spread out documents in silence. The symmetry wasn't lost on me, but I didn't point it out. I didn't need symbolism to make the moment real. He spoke first, carefully, slowly, as if the wrong word might still undo what was happening. I feel like you've been pulling away, he said. I nodded, not defensively, not dramatically, just honestly. I have. That was it. No justification, no softening. He looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something. Anger, hurt, blame. I gave him none of it. What he found instead was calm, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. Why didn't you tell me it was this bad? He asked. It wasn't an unfair question, but it was a late one. I did, I said, just not loudly, and not all at once. I explained without heat, without rewriting history. I spoke about patterns, not incidents, about roles, not intentions, about how often my flexibility had been treated as a default rather than a choice. I didn't say you did this to me. I said, this is what our marriage became. He interrupted once, out of habit, then stopped himself, as if realizing the irony too late. I let the silence sit, not to punish him, but because I no longer rushed to make conversations comfortable. I didn't know you felt that way, he said again. I know, I replied. And I meant it. That was the core of it. Not malice, not betrayal, but a kind of blindness made possible by my willingness to compensate. He asked if there was anything he could do now. The question was sincere and impossible. I don't want to rebuild something that only works when I disappear inside it, I said. Calmly, steadily. There were tears then. On his side. Not loud ones. Quiet, stunned ones. The kind that comes when someone realizes they are losing something they never learned how to hold properly. I didn't mirror them. Not because I was unfeeling, but because I had already grieved this privately. Months ago. Years ago, maybe. We talked logistics, respectfully, without bargaining, without threats. Two adults acknowledging the end of a shared structure. There was sadness. Of course there was. But there was no chaos. When the conversation ended, I felt something close to relief. Not because it was over, but because it had finally been named without distortion. The absence of heat didn't make it less real. It made it final. After the marriage ended, people expected a transformation they could recognize. They expected anger or liberation so loud it bordered on performance. They expected a woman eager to reclaim herself through visible change, new habits, new declarations, a rebranding of identity that made sense from the outside. That wasn't what happened. What happened was quieter. I didn't feel like I had found myself because I had never been lost. I felt like I had returned to parts of myself that had been waiting patiently, unacknowledged but intact. My life didn't become dramatically different overnight. My days still had structure. My work still mattered. I still woke up early, made coffee, and moved through the world with intention. The difference was internal and profound. I no longer edited myself for the sake of ease. When I spoke, I didn't preface my thoughts with apologies. When I made decisions, I didn't scan the room for permission. When something felt wrong, I trusted that feeling without needing to convert it into something more acceptable. This wasn't defiance, it was alignment. I noticed how much energy I had been spending on anticipation, predicting reactions, smoothing outcomes, preventing discomfort before it had a chance to appear. Without that constant vigilance, my mind felt clearer. My body felt lighter. I didn't replace the marriage with another relationship. I didn't rush to fill the space it left behind. I allowed the space to exist. And in that space, I learned something important about myself. I am not built for invisibility. Not because I need attention, but because I need truth. I still value calm. I still value nuance. I still listen more than I speak. Those traits didn't disappear. What disappeared was the belief that they required my silence. People respond to me differently now. Some with curiosity, some with subtle discomfort, some with respect that arrives a second too late to feel natural. I notice it, and I don't adjust. This version of me isn't hardened. She isn't cynical. She's simply no longer available for arrangements that require her to shrink. The quiet dominance people mistake for coldness is actually something gentler, self-trust. And once you have that, you don't need to prove anything. There is a particular kind of ending that doesn't ask for applause. No one claps when a woman stops explaining herself. No one cheers when she chooses dignity over endurance. There's no soundtrack for the moment you quietly decide that love should not require your disappearance. And yet, those endings are the ones that last. When I look back now, I don't feel bitterness toward my marriage. Bitterness would suggest I was wronged in a way that needed repayment. What I feel instead is clarity about the cost of silence and compassion for the version of myself who believed that being easy to love meant being easy to overlook. I wasn't foolish. I was conditioned to believe that harmony mattered more than honesty. That patience was a virtue even when it erased me. That if something truly mattered, it would surely be noticed without my having to name it. But relationships don't work on intuition alone. They work on attention. If there is one truth I carry forward, it's this. Being quiet does not obligate you to be invisible. You don't need proof of cruelty to justify choosing yourself. You don't need a villain to leave a story that no longer includes your full humanity. And you don't need to make noise for your decision to be valid. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop compensating and let reality reveal itself. I didn't leave to punish. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I left because I finally understood that fairness should not require constant negotiation, and love should not depend on how well you disappear. If this story resonated with you, maybe it's because you've recognized a familiar quiet in your own life. A place where you've been strong for too long without being seen. A role you've played so well that no one remembers to ask who you are underneath it. So I'll leave you with this. No pressure, no judgment, just an honest question. Have you ever mistaken your ability to endure for proof that a situation was right for you? If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes, naming the truth out loud is the first step toward reclaiming it.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.